All right, so it is just about 12 o'clock, and we have a lot to get through today, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, and welcome to the 2022 Arbo-READ-um author visit. Tredyffrin Public Library and Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens are thrilled to welcome Dr. Kimberly Nicholas for an afternoon presentation and Q&A session. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Zoe Mills, and I am the Adult Programming and Community Outreach Librarian at Tredyffrin Public Library. Tredyffrin Public Library is excited and proud to announce a partnership between the library and Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens. This collaborative partnership allows the library to reach its mission of leading and strengthening a community of lifetime learners engaged in discovery, creation, entertainment, and enrichment. Let's hear from Amy next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Mobby, and I'm the Education Manager at Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens. If you're not familiar with our organization, Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens is a 48-acre botanical garden located in the Philadelphia suburb of Devon. We specialize in plants native to the region and are also home to a world-class collection of azaleas and rhododendrons. Jenkins is open every day of the year, and just like the library, we're always free for visitors.
Let's highlight the 2022 Arbo-READ-um program. The Arbo-READ-um event is a program series born from a collaboration between the library and Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens. During the program, the library and the Arboretum work together to provide opportunities to promote literacy, library and Arboretum usage, and community conversations by encouraging Tredyffrin Township to come together by reading and discussing a single book. For 2022, we are reading and discussing Dr. Kimberly Nicholas's book, Under the Sky We Make: How to Be Human in a Warming World. Don't worry if you have yet to get your hands on a copy of the book. Attendees of this program will receive a free copy of Under the Sky We Make, which can be picked up at either Tredyffrin Public Library or Jenkins Arboretum and Gardens. An email with details will be sent shortly, so keep an eye out. Now, let's hear from Amy about our next Arbo-READ-um program and how the library and Arboretum collaborate.
Thanks, Zoe. Jenkins has enjoyed all of our collaborations with the library. I've had so much fun working with Michelle Bollet with the Children's Department on their plant club with kids. I got to connect with the plant club via Zoom, and we got to talk about how plants grow, what makes a fruit, and even I led an on-site tour for the kids and their families this past spring. We've also brought some of our outreach efforts to the library's adult audience via visual and virtual presentations ranging from botany to butterflies to native plants. And our collaborations continue. The next event in our Arboretum series is a free virtual lecture on climate change science and trends in Pennsylvania, titled Pennsylvania's Changing Climate. Zoe and I would like to invite you all to join us on Thursday, August 18th at 7 p.m. to hear from Pennsylvania state climatologist Kyle Imhoff.
Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kimberly Nicholas. Professor Kimberly Nicholas is a sustainability scientist at Lund University in Sweden. She has published over 55 articles on climate and sustainability in leading peer-reviewed journals, writes for publications such as Elle, The Guardian, Scientific American, and New Scientist, and is the author of Under the Sky We Make: How to Be Human in a Warming World, and the monthly climate newsletter, We Can Fix It. She gives lectures and moderates at about 75 international meetings and organizations each year across public policy, civil society, arts and culture, the wine industry, foundations, and academia. Her work has been featured by outlets including the BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, National Public Radio International, Vox, and USA Today. Born and raised on her family's vineyard in Sonoma, California, she studied the effect of climate change on the California wine industry for her PhD in the interdisciplinary program in Environment and Resources at Stanford University. Finally, let's hear from Kimberly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And Zoe and Amy, thank you so much for inviting me. I was so thrilled when you let me know that Under the Sky We Make was chosen for the Arboretum this year. I love libraries and books, and I love botanical gardens and plants. So combining those two was really an honor for me. So thank you for this opportunity. I want to share with you today some ideas and hopefully a bit of inspiration about facing the climate crisis with facts, feelings, and action. A little bit about where I come from. So I'm now, excuse me, I'm now a professor in Sweden, but I grew up in this beautiful place, Sonoma. It's about an hour north of San Francisco in the Bay Area in California. My PhD, as you mentioned, was on wine and climate change in the California wine industry. And this is an issue very close to my heart. It's the life, blood, and livelihood for many families and friends in the area. It really shapes the landscape and the history and culture, and is an important part of really what it means to be Sonoma. But unfortunately, like many other places around the world, the wine country is threatened by climate change. We've seen, for example, increasing weather variability, and the most dramatic example is this huge change in the fire regime in California. My family was evacuated in 2017 from fires that threatened to burn the very center of my hometown of Sonoma. Thankfully, that outcome was stopped, but there were many thousands of people who lost homes in this fire, and dozens who lost lives. We know that these fires are about twice as big, and the fire season is extending very rapidly, caused by human-caused climate change since my childhood. So it's become really clear to those of us, it's not just a projection in the future anymore. We're really now living in an age of climate crisis, and it's part of our daily reality. And this is something that has dramatically become clear in the wine region in the last few years. It's a sign, wine is kind of a canary in the coal mine as a climate sensitive crop. It's a symbol for really what's at risk in the climate crisis, which is basically everything that we love and care about, because everything alive depends on a stable climate to say where they can live and how they can make a living. And that's true for people, and it's true for nature and the ecosystems we depend on. So really what we see from the research is a sign that life on Earth is in big trouble. And as I'll show you in a minute, we really, those of us alive today and here on this Zoom call together, among others, we're the ones who happen to be alive today are the ones who have to fix it. And what I mean by fixing it is working as hard as we can to get to zero emissions as fast as possible so that we stabilize climate with as little warming as possible. We've already warmed a little over 1 degree. The aim is to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And we know that the more closer we can get to that number, it's really a big difference between life and death for many people and places around the world. We also, at the same time, need to stop biodiversity loss and protect nature while centering human well-being, while putting care for people at the heart of everything we do. So that's the overview. Let's look at the facts that we need, just the basics that we need to understand the challenge that we face and inform what it is that we need to do, the actions we need to take. We can sum up really centuries at this point of climate research and tens of thousands of peer-reviewed studies and thousands of pages of summaries of those studies from this authoritative source, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in really just almost a haiku, or at least five lines. What science tells us is it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it. And increasingly, I focus more and more of my work shifting from the first half here on the left towards the right of what is it we need to do to fix it. That's where our attention goes today, because there's so much overwhelming evidence establishing those first 4 pieces of summaries. This is an illustration from Rob Jackson and colleagues at Stanford, and it shows our carbon budget. That's the amount of carbon from primarily fossil fuels that we can burn and stay within this limit of 1.5 degrees. That's the goal of the Paris Agreement. And I'll show you now in a way that always quickens my heart a little bit where we're at with that budget. If the edge of the bucket is the budget, you see that the bucket is almost totally full. So in my grandparents' time, and even in my parents' time, when they were born, not too much of the carbon budget had been used up. But since I was born around now, you can see that the majority of the carbon budget has been used up. And at current rates, we have about 85 months of carbon budget left. That means that my passport is set to expire after our current carbon budget will if we don't make the changes that are needed. So we're just on the cusp. The IPCC calls it a rapidly closing window where we can preserve a livable future for us and for life on Earth. And the reason for that is that carbon in the atmosphere, some of it lasts essentially forever. And it's like a bathtub or a bucket, as I showed you in the last slide, where the sources of carbon and other climate pollution are filling the bathtub like water from the tap. The level of the water in the bathtub represents the concentration, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. And then there are sinks like the drain that are removing carbon from the atmosphere. So we have our human-caused sources of adding carbon. About almost 90% is from burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. The remainder comes from land use change like deforestation and animal agriculture. The nature actually takes up about half of what humans add to the atmosphere through natural processes on land and in the oceans. But since we're only removing half of what's added every year from the tap, the level is rising. And that's why the concentration of carbon in our atmosphere is going up, and that's why more heat is being trapped. This is a legacy. The carbon legacy is something that will outlast anything else that we can say or do in our lifetimes. Carbon, some of it lasts 10,000 years in our atmosphere. When you consider that Stonehenge or the pyramids of Giza are roughly half that old, so some of the oldest sort of big monuments that humans have made are nowhere near as long lasting as the molecule of carbon that we would release every day through burning fossil fuels and living our lives. You realize this carbon legacy is something that we really need to focus on. Another way of visualizing how urgent this challenge is now, it's not a bucket, but this black diamond ski slope, which is the slope of the line now. Basically, the carbon budget is this area under the curve, this region here. And if we had gotten started earlier, it would have been a lot easier because we could have made a slower and more gradual transition. But since emissions have only been going up over time, we're now left at these last few critical years where it's actually physically possible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The closer we can get to that, again, the better life on Earth will be. So how do we do that? What needs to happen? At the broad brush, humans need to cut greenhouse gases in half by 2030. That is a lot, and that's very fast. There has been progress, so things have been slowly going in the right direction, but they need to speed up a lot. What you can see, in the past, before the Paris Agreement, we were headed for something maybe even above 4 degrees of warming. The current projections for policies that we have today are somewhere just below 3 degrees of warming. So that's progress. It's a big improvement. It's still not good enough, and we have to do more and faster as individuals, governments, and businesses, as we'll talk about, to actually get to this black diamond ski slope, this very fast reduction that's necessary to stabilize the climate quickly. So because carbon lasts forever, we've got a big job to do, and we basically have to do 2 things to stop climate change, to actually start fixing it. It's to first turn off the tap and stop adding greenhouse gases and especially carbon to the atmosphere. So we're going to have to stop burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. And we're also going to have to stop destroying nature, stop expanding agriculture to make use of the land we already have much better, to protect and restore nature. And we need to do those things like our lives depend on it, because they really do. Again, nature is not just a luxury or a nice to have. It's the source of sustenance for our lives in the first place. And it's not possible to live without enough healthy nature. So that means we're going to have to stop both producing and consuming fossil fuels. You may have heard the statistic that 100 companies are responsible for over 70% of carbon pollution from fossil fuels. And that's true. And you see the names of some of those big companies here, these oil industries and fossil fuel companies. What's also true is that over 2/3 of climate pollution comes from households. So if you think about it for a second, those two numbers add up to more than 100%. How can that be true? Well, you see it in this graph here, which traces the emissions from extraction, basically, to the sector that they're used in, whether that's to produce energy or for agriculture, to the output they produce, and finally, who is it that's consuming, that's paying for basically burning that fossil fuel. And what you see is that it's mostly households, and as I'll show in a few minutes, it's mostly households in high income countries like the US and Sweden. So we need to both stop the production and consumption of fossil fuels and work coherently along this whole chain. How are we going to do that? Well, I argue that at the root of many of our problems is what I call the exploitation mindset. That's the idea that humans are superior to nature, and the mistaken belief that some humans are superior to others. So this kind of hierarchical thinking and this ethos of domination, I think, is what gets us into a lot of our problems that we have today. And I'm arguing instead for putting care and respect and protecting both people and nature at the heart of everything we do. The way we can do that is by stopping harm at the source, getting to the root of problems and treating their source rather than their symptoms, turning off the tap of fossil fuels, and by building resilience. And that will help us cope with the changes we can't avoid, while stopping harm at the source helps us avoid the changes that we can't cope with. Okay, well, those are the facts, and I know that they're tough and can be overwhelming. That's something I kept quiet about for a very long time as a scientist. But what I've found is that talking more and writing more and discussing more and having more conversations about all the climate feels, as I call it, has really helped open doors both to personal connections and community and to action. I think many of us now have stories of climate losses. We're seeing these changes around us, from the fires in my home area of the wine country of California, or here in my adopted country, for example, in Sweden. This is an art installation by two Swedish artists, Bigert and Bergström, who made this installation called A Rescue Blanket for Kebnekaise. Kebnekaise is Sweden's tallest mountain, or rather it was Sweden's tallest mountain. I actually had the chance to hike it with my husband in 2019. And I got to about here, if you can see my cursor, close to where this yellow backpack is, before I turned around. It was too steep and slippery, and I didn't have crampons and the right equipment. I found out a few weeks after I hiked it that it had been officially measured, and this glacier covering the top that the artists were trying to protect with this covering had actually melted enough due to climate change that it was no longer Sweden's tallest mountain. And this rocky peak in the background that doesn't have snow on top was now the new tallest peak. So we're redrawing the maps. We're entering a lot of unknown territory. And I guess what I've learned is confronting that grief and anger and other emotions is necessary and important, and part of getting the energy to keep doing this work and to actually build community and joy while we're doing it. So I'm engaging with this process of what I call radical climate acceptance. And that's viewing reality as it is, without distortion or judgment, to change what we can and accept what we can't. That's what I'm aiming for. And I think the path to do that is these 5 steps. We all start out in ignorance. We need to learn about the climate crisis from somewhere, from a book, from teachers, from school, from some source. So once we have some information, we get out of ignorance, but often the next step is avoidance. These facts are uncomfortable and we don't want to face them. We're more challenged by facing them than by ignoring them. At some point, it becomes more uncomfortable to continue ignoring them than to face the facts. And often what happens next is people Google a lot, read a lot of depressing stuff, doomsday scenarios and understandings, and slide into doom. And that's a really dark and scary place to be. So I guess the good news is that doom is not the end of engaging with the climate crisis. It's a stage. But the bad news is the only way out is through. And that is through all the feels. That's through facing and and acknowledging and giving space for these feelings of sadness and grief from losing things that we love and care about, anger at the injustice of those who have caused the most harm are suffering the least, and vice versa, for example. But what lies at the end of this path is actually purpose. And that's where we can figure out what is that we can uniquely contribute and where can we play a role in what's needed to stabilize the climate. And I guess that's what the rest of my time I'll use to try and suggest to you, hopefully some avenues and concrete specific actions that are needed. And hopefully you will figure out which of these resonate with you. How can you align with what you can offer, your skills, what you think is fun, what you're able to contribute to help make this change happen. So that's the action part of what can I do? I'm actually going to start with some suggestions of what you can stop doing, because we all have the same 24 hours in a day. We need to sleep and take care of our health. We need to prepare meals, take care of family members. Most of us have a job, or whether it's inside or outside the home. And that means we already have pretty full lives. So it doesn't necessarily work to layer more timed demands on top of those full lives. But I would start with thinking about, what is it I can avoid doing? What is it I can say no to that I don't need to do? Not these essential things that I need for my health and happiness and livelihood, but what is it that I'm doing when I maybe am avoiding uncomfortable feelings like scrolling on social media in my case, and maybe many others. What I realize is that when you look at it, Americans spend something like 10 hours a day on media usage. And I would encourage you to have a look at your own media consumption and see what it is that's serving you, that you find informative and inspiring and empowering, engaging. Definitely keep that. But if there are habits that aren't serving you and aren't giving you energy and aren't actually renewing your spirit, maybe those are a place to cut and find what we're looking for is 20 minutes a day. That you get, a day off a week to rest. But 20 minutes a day is actually a huge amount more than most people are doing today. Less than 10% of Americans volunteer or donate money to climate or environmental organizations. They're not giving any of their time or money. And if more of us started doing this, it would make a huge difference. So keep an eye out now for the 5 roles I'm going to describe to you, and think about where it is that you want to start with your work. All right, so these roles are here in the middle. We'll go through each of them as consumer, as an investor, a role model, as a part of organizations in our professional lives, and as citizens. And these roles come from a scientific paper that I published with colleagues last year. We were really happy that it was actually picked up by the Don't Look Up film and online platform, and that they consulted my colleague Christian Nielsen, the first author, in recommending actually really high impact climate actions that were based on our research and other colleagues. So let's look in more detail at what those actions are. First, as a consumer, this is often what people might think about when they think about individual action. And it's definitely important, but not the only role. I just want to put in a little context. I think many of us in countries like the US don't realize how outsized of an impact we have through our consumption choices globally. That about 70% of household emissions that come from households, the majority of it, 50%, actually comes from the top 10% of households. Globally, many people on Earth still live at a very, very modest standard of living. In some cases where their basic needs for sanitation, clean water, nutritious food, safe shelter are not even being met. And that group actually needs to and has the right to, and also has the space to actually increase their consumption in order to meet those needs. So when we talk about reducing consumption, I'm talking about this group, which is about this top 10% globally who live at the standard of living that many Americans might take for granted, but certainly is not the standard around the world. We really see that in this graph here. So first, let's look at this purple line, the sustainable level of climate pollution per year, what we need to actually limit warming to 1.5 degrees is a little bit above around 2 tons per person per year. And the bottom 50% are well below that level. That's why they have room to increase. The middle 40% globally are not too far above that level. So making changes to energy systems and transportation systems to be zero emissions will be sufficient for that group to make their emissions sustainable. But it will not be sufficient for those of us, which includes myself, in this top 10% and certainly in the top 1%. You need to earn $38,000 a year or more to be in the top 10% globally. That's most Americans. To be in the top 1% globally, you need to earn $109,000 per year or more. So this bar is not billionaires. Billionaires also need to reduce their carbon footprint, but there's not that many billionaires. But there are a lot of 1%ers and 10%ers who cause the majority of emissions. If we break that down, where do those emissions come from? The pattern, these are data from Europe, but it's the same pattern as we see globally. The majority of emissions from overconsumers comes from transportation. It's from flying and driving. That's this purple and this pink bar respectively. You see that those really increase a lot compared with lower incomes and make up the majority of emissions at this highest income level. So we have to do a lot of both ands. It's not only about reducing overconsumption, but it's also not only about making system changes, because those system changes to have a fossil-free energy and transport system, for example, won't be enough to make everybody sustainable, given that we have still overconsumption. It will be sufficient for this group of the bottom 90% who are consuming a reasonable amount. But for those of us who are in this top group, the more we're consuming, the more we have to actually reduce our overconsumption to make this target actually work. So how do we do that? Seth Wines and I published a paper quantifying the emission savings from personal climate actions a few years ago. It was made into this lovely infographic by Information is Beautiful. The bottom line is the high impact climate actions are to go car, flight, and meat free. Actually, flight should be first in that order. If you fly, that's your biggest source of emissions, and that's where you can cut the most emissions by skipping flights. Next, cars, and next, meat consumption. If you can't get all the way to zero, that's okay. I haven't either, but I've made big strides towards actually meeting the sustainable levels in these areas. So don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. A good goal is to start with, is it feasible? Could I think of trying to cut my emissions in half, or cut my number of flights in half, or the amount I drive? Does that mean that I could carpool and then I have, I've eliminated another car from the road because twice as many people are traveling in one car, for example. So you can get creative about this, but find something that works for you. And if you're going to focus on your own footprint, because you're in this high impact group who has a disproportionate responsibility, focus on these three areas: flights, car, and meat free. You don't need to think about much else, actually. What does it look like for diet? This is the Harvard Planetary Health Plate, and the goal should be to have about half of our plate at most meals covered by fruits and vegetables. Whole grains are also a bigger part of this plate, and you see that animal protein, where it's included, is a highlight, it's an accent, it's not at the center of the plate. The sustainable level for a healthy and sustainable diet is about 1 glass of milk or 1 piece of cheese the size of your thumb per day, a couple of eggs, fish, and chicken servings per week, and about 2 burgers per month. So that's what we're aiming for from both a health and a climate standpoint. Oh, sorry. And that can be beautiful as well as delicious. This website, the Planetary Health Plate, has a lot of recipes and inspiration from cultures around the world who already eat this way. And there's, many, there's a lot of tradition and culinary skill behind it, as you can see. Okay, what about as an investor? Well, most of us are not Warren Buffett, but you might have a pension plan. You will almost certainly have a bank, which is where most of the money is kept, and therefore where a lot of the loans are made that are financing fossil fuel expansion, for example. So here is a way that we can have a big impact. The high impact actions here are to break up with your mega bank. If your bank is a household name like Bank of America, where I previously banked, Chase, where I previously had a credit card, many others that are, trip easily off the tongue, they are still funding fossil fuels years after the Paris Agreement was signed, decades after it's been clear from the science that this needs to stop. So they've run out of time and excuses. Divestment and taking your money away from these banks and putting them in, for example, a credit union, which is what I've done for the US, is a high impact climate action. Divesting your pension if you have one and your investments if you have them. So you can look at a calculator, fossil-free funds, that will tell you what's the carbon footprint of my current portfolio or investments, and talk with a financial advisor about how to and which assets to choose instead that are actually compatible with a safe climate. And to support campaigns at school or at work, Harvard had a big victory pretty recently. Students had been working for 10 years to get the university to divest from fossil fuels. And these matter materially. They actually shift how investors work, and they also matter culturally. They send a signal, look, the era of fossil fuels is coming to a close. We have to be planning for that and preparing for that in all aspects of society. If you're in a position where you're able to make charitable donations, I'm aiming to donate 10% of my income to charities that work for causes I believe in. And I think, whatever you can afford to give, if it's $5 a month or $5 a year, a lot of these organizations benefit from saying they have this number of members or this number of supporters. So that also can matter. And if you don't have money to donate, certainly donating time is also extremely helpful and meaningful. Okay, what can we do as a role model? As I said, all of us do influence those around us. And we know from social science research that one of the biggest influences on people's behavior is the behavior of the people around them, their family and friends and close associates. So in that sense, what we do really matters. I really like this post from Emily Atkin. She writes the newsletter Heated, where she talked about against meat posting. Meat posting is a term that she coined it means glorifying meat consumption on social media. So, here's a picture of all my juicy steaks on the grill, for example. She says meat is like fossil fuels, but they're tasty. So, you wouldn't post a picture of like, here's this oil spill that, I'm helping to contribute to by still being part of the fossil economy. We shouldn't be normalizing and glorifying overconsumption of things that we know are unsustainable. If we're aiming for a couple of burgers per month as no more than that for our meat consumption, don't have pictures and be setting a norm and a standard where, vastly more meat consumption than that is glorified. I've tried to do this myself in different ways and recognize that I, as a scientist, do have a responsibility and a bigger role in role modeling and practicing what I preach. Eventually, I went from being a frequent flyer to someone who stopped flying within my continent and has reduced my flying more than 90%. I haven't stopped entirely. It's still a journey that I'm working on. But I went from taking 15 flights a year in 2010, my peak flying year, down to 1 per year now to see family back in California. And that means I donated my former frequent flyer card to this museum, which is, excuse me. Sorry about that. I donated my frequent flyer card to a museum, which is looking back on the fossil fuel era from 2053, when the world has made a successful transition away from fossil fuels. So, the text that accompanies this says, isn't this unbelievable and ridiculous that we used to have these cards that incentivized climate harm and gave rewards for causing climate harm so that you could more easily cause more of it. So doing things that we know are high impact, like pledging to stay on the ground or to fly less, and talking about it with friends and family, pushing for better workplace policies that support us in doing that, finding ways to get to work without driving, and demanding that your employer makes that easier and cheaper for you, cooking and sharing awesome meals that are plant-based and good for the planet and biodiversity, And talking about climate and gathering people together, these are how we can really shift the needle and start to change culture and not just only our individual actions. Okay, then we have roles as professionals often, or as part of organizations that could be, NGOs, for example. One thing is, we spend a lot of our time at work, and we need all jobs to be climate jobs. So some people feel called to make a career switch to go into climate work full time and devote their working hours, their most productive hours, towards that goal. I think that's wonderful if that calls to you and if you're able to make that change. We also need all industries and all sectors to be climate safe, to make this fast and fair transition to a fossil-free world. So we need people in the wine industry, for example, where I have a lot of friends and colleagues who are leading this charge, to be pushing towards zero emissions, to divesting, to getting supply chains that can work with greater, much lower emissions. I think a really good place to start there is science-based targets. That's the most rigorous, non-greenwashy label that you can have, and it gives a bunch of standards and guidance on how to measure and then actually reduce your emissions as a business. Pushing for divestment from the banking and the investments that you have as a business there, looking at your supply chain, and what are the things that are out of your direct control. Those are under the direct control of someone else. So you start to see how all the pieces fit together and how maybe you can be a part of pushing the whole industry towards the sustainable changes that need to happen. Standards can be really important here, making agreements and ambitious and strong and very near term, soon agreements about making these changes happen. That's how you can make your job a climate job. And I recommend, for more advice here, this publication you can find online, Climate Solutions at Work, which is Project Drawdown's advice for how you, as an employee of whatever company, whatever field, whatever organization you're working in, how is it your job can become a climate job? What is it that's within your power at work to do? I couldn't resist adding this photo, which is of me and my book club reading Jeff Vandermeer's Hummingbird Salamander. And so I've been part of a climate fiction book club for many years now, and it's been a wonderful source of discussion and support and inspiration over the years. So I really believe in the power of books and libraries in particular. So I think convening these kind of groups, whether it's through a library, through a bookstore, with friends, with neighbors at work, this can be a launching point for discussion and a group in which you can get support to actually make these changes that we need. And then finally, the fifth role is as a citizen. Only about 18% of people live in countries that are democracies at the level of the US or the UK or better. So it's something we cannot take for granted. We might be aware that it feels increasingly under threat and fragile, something that we need to actually continually reinvent and work for. And that includes being really engaged as a citizen. We know that political actions are really effective. The most effective there is to vote. And it's important to vote for candidates with good climate scores. You can look at the League of Conservation Voters for how politicians have voted and make sure that you're electing and keeping in office those who have a real record of supporting the climate. And a study has shown that electing women to the national parliament or Congress actually statistically significantly reduces emissions. So these can guide some of our voting decisions. Getting active in a political party or a climate organization that can represent your views and values at a higher political level is a really effective way of making your voice heard. We know from social science research that creating media attention does really influence politicians. So writing letters to the editor, participating in political demonstrations, those things can really move the needle. And something that's often overlooked, but we know is really effective, is directly writing or picking up the telephone and calling your rep, even though it sounds maybe a bit scary or old-fashioned, that really works. Elected officials hear a lot from highly paid lobbyists who do not have the public interest at heart. They don't hear very much from their constituents, the ordinary people that they're actually elected to represent. So the more they actually hear from you, the better. And I have some guidance in my newsletter, We Can Fix It, over on Substack, of what can you say, how can you say it, what has been shown to be effective. It doesn't have to be, personal. It can be personal, it can be short. You don't need to be a topic expert in order to express what you care about. So wrapping up here, I have this kind of in here to put the pieces together a little bit, that basically I see the way that change happens as a circle and not a waterfall. So it's not the case that we just need to do one thing. We have to put all our eggs in only one basket and make one change that then will kind of spill down from the top. But rather, it's a process of interaction. It's really a web where eventually changing hearts and minds is necessary before we can change behaviors and policies. And that's where system change manifests itself and becomes visible. It can be really hard to see or measure how change happens or what the change that we're working for. I mean, I try to use the standard of, my mission is to keep carbon out of the atmosphere. That's what I'm trying to help people do and to do myself, because that, I feel, makes the biggest positive impact for the things that I care the most about. But it's hard to know exactly how many tons of carbon am I keeping out of the atmosphere by giving this talk, and what will you do with this information, and where will you take it, or who will you tell about it? But nonetheless, it's important to keep going. We know that it really does matter. And this circle here consists of people who are not just consumers buying what businesses sell, but they also are creating demand through those choices. They're also citizens who are interacting with their government and pushing for stronger policies and bolder climate politics. And they're also part of businesses working, it's individuals who work in government and create these policies and uphold these institutions. It's individuals who work at and lead companies and interact in the ways of lobbying and regulation. So we need everyone to do their part so that individuals are not just being an individual, coming together and pushing both business and government and leading by our own example for the kind of world we want to live in. We need government to set the rules to make this fast and fair transition to a fossil-free world and stabilize the climate. And we need businesses to actually align their operations with zero emissions, to start planning and putting money and human power and real boots on the ground behind this accepted goal of where they need to go. So to wrap up, do you have in mind what it is you're going to stop doing that's not serving you, or shift doing so that it is part of your daily life already, but directed towards climate action? And in what domain is it that you're going to do that? Which of your 5 climate superpowers do you feel called to start with? Is it as a consumer, where you can reduce your flights, driving, and meat consumption as your high impact actions? Is it as an investor, where you can switch your bank, divest, and donate your money and time to climate organizations? As a role model, where you're leading by example and talking about it, inspiring others? Maybe as a professional, where you're following the best practices from science-based targets and working to make your job a climate job? Or as a citizen, where you're voting, volunteering, getting media, talking to your rep, and protesting? These are things that we know from research really work. They can be aligned with your values to fit into your life and really help you feel like what you do matters, and to realize that what you do matters, because it really does. I'm currently working on a new project, which is a personalized climate action guide. It will be kind of like a choose your own adventure, where there'll be as few questions as possible to guide you through the guide and get you to, this intersection of what are you good at, what do you care about, and what is high impact and evidence-based we know works to make this change and help stabilize the climate. So if you're interested in learning more about that and in being a beta tester, please sign up for We Can Fix It on my website here, and you'll be in the know of everything that's happening in the development that we make there. You can give it a test when it's ready. So with that, we have, I think, about 15 minutes for questions, and I would love to hear from you any questions about the book, anything we've talked about today, anything you might have read, or you're very welcome again to subscribe over at We Can Fix It. I would love to see you there. Maybe I can ask Amy if she could please put the link in the chat so you have that available. And with that, I'll stop and say thank you for your time and looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. If you raise your hand, I can allow you to talk to directly ask your question, or you feel free to put it in the chat or Q&A. While everyone thinks of questions, we, Amy and I, have created questions ourselves. Amy, would you like to ask the first question?
Sure. I'm going to get off script just quick here, Zoe, for you. But Kimberly, I'm curious, with the pandemic that we have gone through and continue to go through, I feel like there have probably already been some shifts in behaviors with, flights and cars and certain consumption. I mean, do you feel hopeful that this is kind of one of those silver linings of the pandemic, that maybe some people's behaviors are shifting? And now is kind of the time that we can now focus their new behaviors and connect it with the climate crisis?
Yes, I mean, what the data show us is that people can change behaviors fast. And we saw a big drop, more than a 90% drop, for example, in the first months of the pandemic in 2020 in flying, and a very substantial drop in driving as well. Unfortunately, those numbers have really rebounded close to their pre-pandemic levels, even though the pandemic is, of course, not over. So what that tells us is that people are capable of change, but that it's not that we need policies and infrastructure and culture to change in order to make lasting and sustainable change. So I think we also know from social science research that the moment to create a change is at a moment of disruption. So for example, when people move house or have a baby, they often make a lot of big changes. And that is a really good moment to try and intervene, with options to take transit, for example, or to telecommute. So we know that it works, but unfortunately, I think leaders really haven't taken enough advantage of that in trying to implement policies that will make reductions lasting. And we see, people eager to get back on planes, for example, when they feel that it's safe from a health perspective, but there hasn't been a cultural shift enough about the climate message. But as you say, I mean, I think people have definitely learned, things like this virtual event where I can join you in Pennsylvania and sitting here at my desk in Sweden, that can save a lot of emissions for sure. And many people have found ways of, oh, I don't need to travel so much or so far, or, some people prefer or like working from home. And if that's the alternative is driving a car every day, that's certainly a much lower carbon choice.
Great, thanks.
Looks like Cindy has their hand raised. Let me allow them to go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first, thank you for presenting, Dr. Nicholas. And I'm partway through your book and finding it very helpful because, certainly the whole climate issue has been concerning me. But I'm really liking getting a better sense of what I can do personally and what are kind of like the big things and what are the little things, and don't just, do the little things, but, be more aware of the big things. So I just want to thank you for that. And also I'm a physical therapist and pretty involved in my therapy association. And as was discussed, that during the pandemic, there were a lot of changes made. So within our association, more and more, there were more virtual options. But now, there's encouragement to go to conference. And I think as part of a healthcare association, I also liked your talk today about making your own job a climate job. So I'm kind of thinking, okay, well, within our physical therapy profession, as healthcare providers, people who are concerned about health, how much are we discussing the impacts of climate change on health, and how much are we addressing those? And are we being upfront with our own internal pulls between, yes, having people physically come in for conference is a big money raiser for associations, but how much harm might we be doing by not offering a lot of opportunities so that people can avoid to travel and still participate the way they did during the early stages of the pandemic. So thank you. And you've just kind of triggered a lot of ideas and given some extra resources here and kind of got me thinking about, you know, how I, within my own existing, as a member of an organization, can try to maybe like start a special interest group or some kind of little club within that, both for ourselves as members and also maybe trying to make our association leadership a little more accountable in terms of environmental issues. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Cindy. I really appreciate your kind words, and I, excuse me, I really appreciate your energy to bring climate action to your profession. I know that healthcare professionals have really been picking up the lead in climate action. I see that from the academic side, certainly, where many healthcare professionals, like in the journal The Lancet, for example, have declared a climate emergency, are really making the links between fossil fuels and health. Fossil fuels kill 8 million people a year from air pollution. They're a leading killer globally. About 1 in 5 global deaths is caused from the, not the climate pollution, but the air pollution that gets in our lungs and damages our health. So there are huge health benefits from eliminating fossil fuels, from more active travel instead of sitting in cars, for example. And we know that healthcare professionals are a really highly trusted source of information. So both internally in working with your colleagues and in your communication with your patients, you have a huge, really important role to play. And conferences, as you mentioned, are a really great place to start because we know that those are often the largest source of emissions for professional societies and for groups of academics as well. So having a model I really like, virtual conferences can certainly work well. I think regional hubs can also be a really good solution where people travel short distances to meet locally and then are connected with others virtually. So for example, I was part of a conference that did that in Sweden and in Boston. So those of us in Sweden met centrally, those of us, the East Coasters, gathered together. And that can really reduce emissions a lot. So I think there's a lot of work going on in how to still stay connected, share best practices, share new research and findings with our colleagues and keep those relationships at dramatically lower emissions. So please keep me posted. I would love to hear what you do. And sorry, last thing, Seth Wines has a new paper coming out on what healthcare professionals can do for climate. I'll put his name in the chat. I think it's not published yet, but it will be soon.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you, Cindy. And thank you for adding that to our chat. All right. Someone has a question. Vivian mentioned that you don't mention anything about joining a community-supported agriculture. If you're familiar with that concept of a CSA, where you would pick up variable vegetables weekly from a local farm, and you end up trying different veggies and can also help you to move more towards a plant-based diet. What are your thoughts about CSAs?
Strong endorse. I think I do mention them in the book. I'm part of one here run by my former student, and I agree they offer a great benefit. I also encourage people to grow your own food to the extent that's possible. If you have a garden, of course, you can do a lot, but even a windowsill or a balcony, you can really go a long way to grow some things, to be in touch with the season, even to provide a little bit of habitat for insects. And that also brings more joy and pleasure to your life and to your eating, which is also really important to keep.
Great, thank you. There is another question. There were some great exhibits in the presentation. Are they in the book, or can we get a copy of the presentation?
Yes, I know that the recording, we did record it and it will be shared, so you're welcome to look at that. And my editor nearly killed me because the book has something like 700 footnotes. They're not listed as footnotes for the reader, so you can ignore them if you want, but all the sources are cited in the book, and on the slides as well, the sources of the graphics. So if there's anything in particular you have in mind, you should be able to go back and dig that up.
I just want to give those of you who are still listening a chance to ask questions if you still have them. But I'm thinking, Kimberly, I'll ask one of the questions that we had identified, which I think, your book does an amazing job of helping people move through the climate despair into action. And today's talk was really great in furthering to break down the actions. But how do you feel in general about the scientific community? What job they've done to help people move again from that climate despair into action?
I mean, it's a very big job, and it's not just for scientists to do, certainly. I actually think artists maybe have the biggest role here, and writers and others who can help people tap into their feelings about the human experience. It's definitely not what I was trained to do in grad school. So it's something I'm, going out on a bit of a limb and doing more myself. I think there's some scientists who are amazing at it. Britt Ray comes to mind. She has a new book called Generation Dread and a newsletter by the same name, or Gen Dread, where she really blends the science, particularly of mental health and psychology, with what helps us to build community and personal resilience and to take meaningful action. So her tagline is how to stay sane in the climate crisis. So there definitely are wonderful examples. I mean, I don't want to throw scientists under the bus. I mean, I don't blame my fellow scientists for the predicament that we're in. The science has been clear for a long time, and I think scientists have been doing our best to communicate it. But there's been, what we know now from historians and social science researchers, is that there's really been an active, organized disinformation campaign to prevent scientific information from getting out there and to prevent, most importantly, climate action and politics. I write about that in chapter 7. I can recommend Naomi Oreskes as an excellent source there, and more investigative journalists like Amy Westervelt, for example. But I guess what I'm saying is we don't have enough climate support. I think, people in general are not very well prepared for the scope of the crisis and actually facing up to it. So we just need a lot more people engaged. And I think, Britt has some ideas, and my first podcast, which is on We Can Fix It, was with Britt, and she has some great ideas about how to kind of train people like healthcare providers, for example, and community members and social workers and others who in our daily jobs might be, me, maybe as my role as an advisor to students, how is it we can support each other in addition to mental health professionals, because we know there's just a huge unmet need, basically.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. There is a comment, and then I will let, Amber has their hand raised, I will let them speak. Vivian says, I love your book and I plan to purchase copies and give them to my grandchildren, financial advisor, and political leaders as gifts. Thank you so much for a great awakening and a great read.
Well, thank you, Vivian. And I really appreciate that. And thank you so much. I've been really honored that people have chosen to share the book with their loved ones and their families and friends. And to me, that's like such a huge endorsement. So I really appreciate it that you're doing that. And I'm happy to do talks, or rather more informal conversations with book clubs. So if you get a group of people together, I'm happy to answer questions. And there's more information about that on my website to do a Zoom like this. So, sounds like you're getting a group together. And if you want me to come back, I'd be happy to.
All right, Amber, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Dr. Nicholas, thank you so much. And that is a really generous offer. Thank you for making yourself so available from not so locally. I'm the chair of our township's Environmental Advisory Council, and we have noticed since the pandemic, and I'm sure Amy can speak to this as well, just a general greater awareness and appreciation of the parks in our township and just of outside, whether it's just on people's properties or in their communities. And kind of tying into your comments about scientists from 2 questions ago, I was wondering if you had any suggestions or experiences that you've had, as abroad in your in your own community, and just maintaining that energy and enthusiasm and tying it into this greater climate conversation. Because I just find that people right now seem more motivated to listen, speaking to your, comment about disruption.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I've seen that too and experienced that too, personally, and also in the world around me. I think it's great that people are spending more time in nature. We know that that's good for physical and mental health. And it also builds a connection with nature that motivates people to protect and care for the places around us, and that extends to a better and more sustainable relationship with nature, which is part of what we need. So, I mean, it varies by, the specific actions would vary by exactly where you are, but definitely protecting the nature that you have and potentially expanding it where you can is a really important one. I think it was April 2021, the newsletter edition then was about have a hot date with planet Earth, which was ideas of how to connect with nature around you and some of the tips for doing that. I can also recommend a book called Return to Nature by Emma Lowe, where she writes about different landscapes, including cities and kind of everyday landscapes, and kind of combining the research on how they benefit people and what it is that we can do to protect and preserve those landscapes. So I think it's really smart to be thinking strategically like that, and to think about how to protect and expand the nature that you have in your cities, and to welcome more people and make sure that that nature is accessible to everyone, that everyone feels welcome and can get there and enjoy it, so that they have that experience and build that relationship.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so it is just about 1 o'clock, and I did put the library does have Return to Nature by Emma Lowe, and I put a link in the chat if you are interested in checking that out. But we are just at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, Kimberly. It was really great, and it gave us a lot of great ideas. We're going to push all of the roles you can take on social media so we can get more people interested in the book and taking action.